The cowboy noticed the sky first, how it had turned the color of a fresh bruise, purple and angry, stretching across the New Mexico horizon like a warning nobody wanted to read. Ethan Dalton had seen enough flash floods in his 26 years to know that the dry arroyo he was riding alongside could turn into a raging torrent in minutes. And the pregnant woman struggling with her broken wagon wheel up ahead had no idea what was coming. He spurred his horse forward, dust kicking up beneath the hooves as he approached. The woman looked up at the sound, one hand pressed against her swollen belly, the other shielding her eyes from the sun that was quickly disappearing behind those threatening clouds. She was young, maybe 23 or 24, with dark hair that had escaped its pins and stuck to her neck in the heat. Her dress was simple but well made, and the wagon beside her carried supplies that suggested she had been heading somewhere with purpose. "Madam, you need to leave that wagon and get to higher ground," Ethan called out, dismounting before his horse had fully stopped. "There's a storm coming and this arroyo is going to flood." She straightened up, wincing slightly as she did. "I can't just leave everything. My husband is waiting for me in Las Lunas. I'm already 2 days late because of this wheel." "Your husband would rather have you alive than have whatever is in that wagon," Ethan said, already moving toward her. "How far along are you?" 9 months, she admitted, and something in her voice made him look at her more carefully. Her face was pale beneath the dust and sweat, and she was breathing in a way that suggested she was in more discomfort than she wanted to admit. "But the baby is not due for another week at least." Thunder rumbled in the distance, and Ethan felt the first drop of rain hit his shoulder. "We need to move now. Can you ride?" "I think so," she said, but as she took a step toward his horse, she doubled over with a gasp that told him everything he needed to know. "How long have you been having pains?" he asked, catching her elbow to steady her. She looked up at him with eyes that were suddenly filled with fear. "Since this morning, but they were far apart. I thought I had time to reach town." Ethan looked around quickly, assessing their options. The nearest high ground was a rocky outcrop about a quarter-mile to the east, but the rain was coming harder now, fat drops that exploded against the packed earth. He could hear the water already, a distant roar that was getting closer with each passing second. "What is your name?" he asked, helping her toward his horse. "Gabriella," she said, breathing hard. "Gabriella Zamora." "I'm Ethan Dalton. I'm going to get you somewhere safe, Gabriella, but you need to trust me and do exactly what I say." She nodded, her fingers gripping his arm tightly as another contraction hit her. He could see the water now, a wall of brown foam and debris rushing down the arroyo toward them. There was no time to reach the outcrop. He looked at the wagon, at the sturdy oak construction, and made a decision. "Can you climb into the wagon bed?" he asked. "I think so," she said, and he helped her up, his hands supporting her weight as she struggled over the tailgate. The wagon was loaded with crates and barrels, all tied down securely. He climbed up beside her and started rearranging things, creating a space where she could brace herself. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice rising with panic as the roar of the water grew louder. "This wagon is well made and those supplies will keep it floating," he said, working quickly. "When the water hits, hold onto these ropes and don't let go." He barely had time to position himself beside her before the flood hit. The wagon lurched violently as the water slammed into it, lifting it off its broken wheel and carrying it forward in a spinning rush of chaos. Ethan wrapped one arm around Gabriella and held onto the rope with the other, feeling the wagon buck and twist beneath them like a wild animal. Gabriella screamed as water poured over the sides, soaking them instantly. The wagon hit something, maybe a boulder or a tree, and tilted dangerously. Ethan pulled her closer, shifting their weight to keep them from being thrown out. The supplies, thank God, were doing their job, keeping the wagon buoyant even as it was tossed downstream. "Hold on," he shouted over the roar of the water. "Just hold on." She was holding on to him with a grip that would have been painful if he had time to notice. Her face was pressed against his chest, and he could feel her whole body tensing with another contraction. The timing was terrible, catastrophic even, but babies did not wait for convenient moments. The wagon crashed into something else and spun completely around. Ethan saw a tree branch coming at them and ducked, pulling Gabriella down with him. The branch scraped over their heads with inches to spare, ripping through the canvas cover and sending splinters flying. The wagon was filling with water now, the supplies shifting and settling lower as they became waterlogged. "Ethan," Gabriella gasped, and there was something in her voice that made him look at her. "The baby is coming, I can feel it." "Not yet," he said, knowing it was a useless thing to say. "We need to get out of the water first." "I do not think the baby cares about the water," she said, and despite everything, despite the terror of the moment, there was a hint of humor in her voice that made him look at her with new respect. The wagon hit something solid and stopped moving, caught against an obstruction that held it steady even as the water continued to rush around them. Ethan looked around quickly and realized they had wedged against a massive cottonwood tree that had fallen across the arroyo. The wagon was tilted at an angle but holding, and the tree was creating a partial break in the current. "Can you move?" he asked Gabriella. She shook her head, her face contorted with pain. Another contraction. "They are coming very close together now." Ethan climbed over the side of the wagon and into the water, which came up to his chest. The current was still strong, trying to pull him away, but the tree provided enough shelter that he could brace himself. He reached back into the wagon for Gabriella. "I am going to lift you up onto this tree," he said. "It is wider than the wagon and out of most of the water. Can you hold on while I climb up?" She nodded, her jaw clenched with determination. He got his hands under her arms and lifted, feeling the awkward weight of her pregnant belly between them. She was heavier than he expected, but he managed to get her high enough that she could grab onto the rough bark of the fallen cottonwood. He boosted her up further, helping her swing one leg over until she was straddling the massive trunk. The tree was at least 4 feet in diameter, wide enough to provide a relatively stable platform. He pulled himself up after her, water streaming from his clothes, and helped her shift into a more secure position. The bark was rough and uncomfortable, but they were out of the direct current and several feet above the rushing water. Gabriella cried out, her hands pressing against her belly. "It is coming. The baby is coming now." Ethan looked at her helplessly. He had helped birth calves and foals, had even assisted when a cow was having trouble, but he had never delivered a human baby. He had no medical supplies, no clean water, nothing but his bare hands and whatever courage he could muster. "Tell me what you need," he said, moving closer to her on the tree trunk. "I need my husband," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I need a doctor. I need to not be sitting on a tree in the middle of a flood." "I know," he said gently, "but right now you have me, and I promise you I am going to do everything I can to help you and this baby." She looked at him, really looked at him, and he saw the moment when she made the decision to trust him. She nodded, taking a shaky breath. Okay. I need to be able to move to get into a better position." The tree trunk was slick with water and moss, but there was a place where 2 large branches had broken off, creating a sort of natural seat. Ethan helped her shift toward it, supporting her weight as she moved. The rain was still pouring down, making everything slippery and difficult, but at least it was warm rain. In winter, they would have already died from exposure. Gabriella leaned back against the trunk, her legs bent and braced against the branches. Her dress was soaked through, clinging to her body, and Ethan tried very hard to focus on her face, on keeping her calm, rather than on the overwhelming intimacy of the situation. "What do I do?" he asked. "I do not know," she admitted. "This is my first baby. My mother was supposed to be with me. She knows about these things." Another contraction hit and she bore down, her face turning red with the effort. Ethan positioned himself where he could help, his hands ready even though he had no idea what he was doing. The water rushed beneath them, the rain pounded down, and somewhere in the distance, thunder continued to roll across the New Mexico sky. "You are doing great," he told her, because that seemed like something helpful to say. "Just breathe when you can." "Easy for you to say," she gasped, but there was no real anger in it, just pain and fear and determination. Time lost all meaning. The contractions came one after another, each one seeming to last forever. Ethan talked to her constantly, saying anything that came into his head just to give her something to focus on besides the pain. He told her about growing up on a ranch outside of Santa Fe, about his parents who had died when he was 19, about the years he had spent drifting from town to town looking for something he could not quite name. Gabriella told him about her childhood in Mexico, about crossing the border with her family when she was 10, about meeting her husband Roberto at a church social in Albuquerque. She told him that Roberto was a carpenter, that they had been saving money to open their own shop, that he had gone ahead to Las Lunas to find them a house, and she was supposed to follow with their belongings. "He is going to be so angry with me," she said during a brief respite between contractions. "I told him I would be fine traveling alone. I told him the baby would not come early." "He is not going to be angry," Ethan assured her. "He is going to be grateful you are alive." "Are we going to be alive?" she asked, and her eyes were so wide and frightened that he wanted to promise her anything. "Yes," he said firmly. "You and this baby are both going to be fine. I am not going to let anything happen to either of you." It was a promise he had no business making, but saying it seemed to help her. She nodded and gripped his hand as another contraction began. This one was different, more intense, and Gabriella made a sound that was somewhere between a scream and a growl. "I have to push," she said. "I cannot stop it, I have to push." "Then push," Ethan said, positioning himself to catch the baby. She pushed, her whole body straining with the effort, and Ethan saw the top of the baby's head appear. His heart was pounding so hard he thought it might burst out of his chest, but he kept his hand steady, supporting the baby as more of the head emerged. "One more," he said. "One more big push, Gabriella." She pushed again, crying out with the effort, and suddenly the baby's head was fully out. Ethan cradled it carefully, remembering what he had seen when foals were born, how important it was to support the head and neck. The baby's face was scrunched up and blue-tinged, and for a terrifying moment, Ethan thought something was wrong. Then Gabriella pushed one more time and the baby's shoulders slipped free, followed quickly by the rest of the tiny body. Ethan caught the baby, slippery and impossibly small in his large hands. It was a boy, he realized, and the baby was not breathing. Panic seized him for a moment, but then instinct took over. He turned the baby upside down and rubbed his back firmly, clearing his airway. The baby sputtered, coughed, and then let out a wail that was the most beautiful sound Ethan had ever heard. "Is he okay?" Gabriella asked frantically, trying to see. "He is perfect," Ethan said, turning the baby right side up and placing him on Gabriella's chest. "You have a son, and he is absolutely perfect." Gabriella gathered the baby against her, crying and laughing at the same time. The baby was still crying too, his tiny fists waving in the air, his face turning from blue to pink. Ethan used his knife to cut the cord, tying it off with a strip of fabric torn from his shirt. His hands were shaking now, the adrenaline starting to fade, and he realized he was crying too. They sat there on the tree trunk, rain pouring down on them, holding this new life that had entered the world in the most unlikely of circumstances. The flood was starting to recede, the water level dropping noticeably even as they watched. The storm was passing, the clouds breaking up to reveal patches of blue sky. "Thank you," Gabriella whispered, looking up at him with tears streaming down her face. "Thank you, Ethan. You saved us." "You did all the hard work," he said, but his voice was rough with emotion. "I just caught him." The baby had stopped crying and was making small, snuffling sounds against Gabriella's chest. She had managed to get him partially under her dress, using her body heat to warm him. Ethan took off his vest, which was only slightly less wet than everything else, and draped it over them both. "We need to get you to a doctor," he said. "As soon as the water goes down enough, I will go find help." "What about your horse?" Gabriella asked. Ethan looked around and felt his heart sink. The horse was nowhere to be seen. It had probably bolted when the flood hit, and who could blame it? He hoped it had made it to safety, but right now his concern was for the woman and baby still stranded on this tree. "I will walk if I have to," he said. "Las Lunas cannot be more than a few miles from here." They waited as the water continued to recede. The sun came out, warm and bright, and steam started to rise from the wet ground. Ethan climbed down from the tree as soon as the water was low enough, his legs shaky from sitting in one position for so long. He helped Gabriella down carefully, supporting her weight as she cradled the baby against her chest. The wagon was a complete loss, broken against the tree and stripped of most of its contents. Ethan found a few things that had washed up on the banks, including a blanket that was muddy but intact. He wrapped it around Gabriella and the baby, then lifted them both into his arms. "I can walk," Gabriella protested weakly. "You just gave birth on a tree," Ethan said. "You are not walking anywhere." He carried them along the arroyo, following it east toward where he knew Las Lunas lay. The landscape was transformed by the flood, with debris scattered everywhere and the vegetation flattened and mud covered. His boots squelched through the wet ground, and his arms ached from carrying his precious burden, but he did not stop. They had been walking for about an hour when he heard voices. A group of men appeared over a rise, and Ethan recognized the sheriff's badge on one of their vests. "We need a doctor," Ethan called out. "This woman just gave birth and they both need medical attention." The men rushed forward and one of them, a middle-aged man with a kind face, took Gabriella from Ethan's arms. "I am Dr. Harrison," he said. "We have been searching for survivors from the flood. Let me look at them." Another man, younger and frantic-looking, pushed through the crowd. "Gabriella." "Oh God, Gabriella, I have been searching everywhere for you." "Roberto," Gabriella said weakly, reaching for him. Roberto took her hand, his face streaked with tears. He looked at the baby, then at his wife, then at Ethan, trying to process everything at once. "Your wife is very brave," Ethan said quietly, "and you have a son." Dr. Harrison was checking Gabriella and the baby, his hands gentle and practiced. "They both seem to be doing remarkably well, considering the circumstances," he said. "But we need to get them back to town where I can examine them properly." A wagon was brought up, and Gabriella was settled into it with the baby. Roberto climbed in beside her, still holding her hand, still crying. Gabriella looked back at Ethan, her eyes saying things that words could not express. "Come with us," she said. "Please, Ethan. Let the doctor check you too." Ethan wanted to refuse, to slip away now that his job was done, but his legs chose that moment to give out. He sat down heavily on the ground, suddenly aware of how exhausted he was. Strong hands helped him into the wagon, and then they were moving, bouncing over the rough ground toward Las Lunas. The town was in chaos when they arrived. The flood had swept through the edges of the settlement, damaging buildings and washing away livestock. People were everywhere, cleaning up debris and searching for missing loved ones. The wagon took them directly to Dr. Harrison's house, which doubled as his clinic. Inside, Gabriella was settled into a clean bed, and Dr. Harrison performed a thorough examination of her and the baby. Ethan sat in a chair in the corner, trying to stay awake while another doctor, Dr. Harrison's assistant, checked him over. "You are going to be sore for a few days, but I do not see any serious injuries," the assistant said. "You are lucky. Flash floods kill people every year in this territory." "It was not luck," Ethan said, looking at Gabriella. "It was stubbornness on both our parts." Dr. Harrison approached with a smile. "The baby is healthy, strong lungs, good color, no signs of distress. Gabriella is tired and will need rest, but she should recover fully." "Whatever you did out there, young man, it was enough." Roberto appeared at Ethan's side, his hand extended. "I do not have words to thank you properly," he said. "You saved my wife and my son. I owe you everything." Ethan shook his hand, uncomfortable with the gratitude. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Roberto said firmly. "Not anyone could have done what you did. Please stay with us tonight. Let us feed you, give you a place to rest. It is the least we can do." Ethan wanted to refuse, but he was so tired he could barely think straight. He nodded, and Roberto led him to a small room in the back of the clinic where he could clean up. Someone had found him dry clothes, and there was a basin of warm water and soap. Ethan washed the mud and grime from his skin, looking at his hands and remembering how they had caught that tiny baby, how they had held new life in the midst of all that chaos. He slept then, falling into the bed without even meaning to, and did not wake until the next morning. Sunlight was streaming through the window, bright and cheerful, and for a moment he could not remember where he was. Then it all came back, the flood, Gabriella, the baby, and he sat up quickly. A knock at the door made him call out, and Roberto entered carrying a tray of food. "Gabriella insisted I bring you breakfast," he said. "She wants to see you if you are feeling up to it." Ethan ate quickly, suddenly ravenous, and then followed Roberto back to Gabriella's room. She was sitting up in bed, looking tired but radiant, the baby nursing at her breast. She smiled when she saw Ethan, and he felt something warm unfold in his chest. "Good morning," she said. "Did you sleep well?" "Better than I have in years," he admitted. "How are you feeling?" "Sore," she said honestly, "but happy, so very happy." She looked down at the baby. "We have decided to name him Ethan, after you." Ethan felt his throat tighten. "You do not have to do that." "We want to," Roberto said, "so that he will always know about the man who saved his life and his mother's life." Ethan stayed in Las Lunas for 3 more days while Gabriella recovered. He helped Roberto with small repairs around the house they had rented, work that felt good after years of drifting. He visited Gabriella every day, bringing her things she needed and playing with little Ethan, who was thriving despite his dramatic entrance into the world. On the 4th day, Ethan announced that he needed to move on. He had been heading to Arizona when he stumbled upon Gabriella, and he felt like he should continue that journey. But something had changed inside him during those hours on the tree trunk, holding that baby and helping Gabriella through the hardest thing she had ever done. He felt connected to them in a way he could not quite explain, and the thought of leaving made his chest ache. "Stay," Gabriella said simply when he came to say goodbye. Roberto had gone to his carpentry shop, leaving them alone. "Stay in Las Lunas. Roberto could use help in his shop, and we could use a friend." "I am just a drifter," Ethan said. "I do not stay anywhere for long." "Maybe it is time to change that," she said, looking at him with those dark eyes that seemed to see right through him. "Maybe it is time to find a place to call home." Her words haunted him as he walked through town, his few possessions packed in a bag he had borrowed. He passed the carpentry shop and saw Roberto inside, working on a beautiful cradle. He passed the church where services were being held and heard singing drifting out through the open doors. He passed families working together to repair their homes, neighbors helping neighbors, and he realized that this was what he had been searching for all along. He turned around and walked back to Roberto's shop. The carpenter looked up in surprise when Ethan entered. "I would like to take you up on that offer of work," Ethan said, "if it still stands." Roberto's face split into a huge grin. "It absolutely still stands. When can you start?" "Right now, if you need me." Over the next few weeks, Ethan settled into a rhythm in Las Lunas. He worked with Roberto during the day, learning carpentry and discovering he had a talent for it. He took his meals with the Zamora family, playing with baby Ethan and helping Gabriella when Roberto was working late. He rented a small room above the general store, simple but clean, and for the first time in years he unpacked all his belongings instead of living out of his saddlebags. He tried not to think too much about why he looked forward to evenings at the Zamora house more than anything else, or why his heart beat faster when Gabriella smiled at him. She was a married woman, a new mother, completely off limits. The fact that he had seen her at her most vulnerable, had been the first to hold her son, had shared something so intimate with her, that did not change anything. It could not change anything. But as the weeks turned into months, Ethan began to notice things. Roberto stayed later and later at the shop, sometimes not coming home until after Ethan had already left for the evening. Gabriella seemed quieter, sadder, and there were shadows under her eyes that had nothing to do with the baby keeping her awake. Little Ethan was thriving, growing plump and happy, but the tension in the house was growing too. One evening in late September, nearly 4 months after the flood, Ethan arrived at the Zamora house to find Gabriella crying. The baby was asleep in his cradle, and she was sitting at the kitchen table with her head in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs. "What happened?" Ethan asked, immediately concerned. "Is the baby okay? Are you okay?" "Roberto wants us to move," she said, looking up at him with red-rimmed eyes. "He found work in California, building furniture for some wealthy family in Sacramento. He says the money is too good to pass up, that we need to think about our future." "When does he want to leave?" Ethan asked, sitting down across from her even though his whole world felt like it was tilting sideways. "In 2 weeks." She wiped at her eyes angrily. "I do not want to go, Ethan. I like it here. I have friends here, a community, and you are here." The last part was said so quietly he almost missed it. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw his own feelings reflected in her eyes. It was impossible, wrong, but it was there, this thing that had been growing between them since that day on the tree trunk. "You should go with your husband," Ethan said, even though the words felt like they were being torn from him. "He is right to think about your future." "What about what I want?" Gabriella asked. "Does that not matter?" "Of course it matters," Ethan said. "But you are married, Gabriella. You have a son, you have responsibilities." She stood up abruptly, wrapping her arms around herself. "I know that. Do you think I do not know that? But I cannot help how I feel about you, Ethan. These past months, having you here, it has been the happiest I have been in my whole marriage." Ethan stood too, keeping the table between them because he did not trust himself to be close to her. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that I think I made a mistake," she whispered. "I married Roberto because he was kind and stable, and I thought that would be enough. But I have never felt for him what I feel for you." "You cannot say things like that," Ethan said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Why not?" "Because it is improper. Because I am supposed to pretend that I am happy when I am not," she laughed, a bitter sound. I gave birth on a tree trunk in the middle of a flood, Ethan. I think propriety stopped mattering to me that day. Before Ethan could respond, the front door opened and Roberto walked in. He looked at them standing there, at the tension in the room, and his face hardened. "What is going on here?" he asked. "Nothing," Gabriella said quickly. "Ethan was just leaving." But Roberto was not stupid. He looked between them and saw what Ethan had been trying so hard to deny. "How long?" he asked quietly. "Nothing has happened," Ethan said firmly. "I swear to you, Roberto, I have never touched your wife inappropriately. I would never dishonor her or you that way." "But you want to," Roberto said, and it was not a question. The silence that followed was answer enough. Roberto sank into a chair, suddenly looking much older than his 28 years. "I have known for a while," he admitted. "The way you look at her, the way she lights up when you are around. I told myself I was imagining it, but I was not, was I?" "I am sorry," Ethan said. "I never meant for this to happen. I should have left months ago." "Yes, you should have," Roberto agreed. He looked at Gabriella. "And you should have told me how you felt instead of letting this continue." Gabriella sat down, fresh tears streaming down her face. "I am sorry, too. I do not want to hurt you, Roberto. You have been good to me, a good husband and father." "But you do not love me," Roberto said. "Not the way a wife should love her husband." He rubbed his hands over his face. "I think I have known that for a long time, too, even before Ethan. You married me because I was safe, because your parents approved, not because you loved me." "I do love you," Gabriella protested. "Just not the way you deserve to be loved." They sat in silence, the weight of unspoken truth settling over them. Baby Ethan stirred in his cradle, making small sounds, and Gabriella automatically moved to pick him up. She held him close, and Ethan saw the way Roberto looked at his son, the love and pain mixed together on his face. "I am not going to Sacramento," Roberto said finally. "That job was a lie. I wanted to take you away from here, away from him, hoping that distance would fix whatever was broken between us." He stood up, moving to the window. "But you cannot fix something that was never whole to begin with." "What are you saying?" Gabriella asked, her voice barely audible. "I am saying that I will not keep you in a marriage where you are unhappy," Roberto said. "I will go to Santa Fe and file for divorce. It will be difficult and expensive and people will talk, but I will do it, on one condition." "What condition?" Ethan asked. "That you marry her as soon as the divorce is final," Roberto said, looking directly at Ethan. "That you give her and my son the life they deserve. Can you promise me that?" Ethan looked at Gabriella, at the baby in her arms, at the possibility of a future he had not dared to imagine. "Yes," he said, "I promise you that." The next few months were difficult. Roberto moved to Santa Fe to work with a lawyer on the divorce proceedings. In 1885, New Mexico Territory, divorce was rare and scandalous, but Roberto's lawyer argued abandonment on the grounds that Gabriella had been left alone while heavily pregnant. It was not entirely accurate, but it was close enough to the truth that the judge accepted it. Gabriella moved into a small house that Ethan rented for her, and tongues wagged all over Las Lunas. Some people cut her off completely, unwilling to associate with a divorced woman. But others, including Dr. Harrison and his wife, stood by her. Mrs. Harrison had been at enough births to understand how intense and intimate that experience was, and she told anyone who would listen that sometimes the heart chose at the strangest times. Ethan continued working as a carpenter, building his skills and his reputation. He saw Gabriella every day, but was careful to maintain propriety. He did not want to give people more reason to gossip, and he wanted to honor his promise to Roberto by doing things the right way. Baby Ethan grew into a chubby, happy 6-month-old, then an active 9-month-old who was starting to pull himself up on furniture. Ethan Sr. bought him toys and spent hours on the floor playing with him, making the baby laugh with pure joy. Watching them together, Gabriella felt her heart swell with love and gratitude. The divorce was finalized in March of 1886, nearly a year after the flood that had changed all their lives. Roberto came to Las Lunas one last time to sign the final papers and to see his son. He spent an afternoon with baby Ethan, holding him and talking to him, and when he left his face was wet with tears. "Take care of them," he said to Ethan before he rode away. "I will," Ethan promised, "and thank you for being big enough to let her go." "I did not let her go," Roberto said. "I never had her in the first place." Ethan and Gabriella were married in a small ceremony at the church 2 weeks later. Some people attended, those who believed in second chances and the power of love to find you in the strangest places. Others stayed away, disapproving but no longer openly hostile. Gabriella wore a simple blue dress that brought out the color of the New Mexico sky, and Ethan wore his best suit that he had bought specifically for this day. Father Miguel, who had heard both their confessions and understood the unusual circumstances, performed the ceremony with genuine warmth. "Marriage is a sacrament," he said, "but it is also a choice we make every day. These two have chosen each other after great hardship and with full knowledge of what they are committing to. That is worth celebrating." When Ethan kissed his bride, he thought about that day on the tree trunk, how he had promised to keep her safe, how he had caught her son in his hands and helped bring him into the world. He had never imagined then that this was where they would end up, but it felt right in a way he could not quite put into words. They moved into a larger house that Ethan had been fixing up for months, a surprise for Gabriella. It had 3 bedrooms, a large kitchen, and a workshop attached where Ethan could work on special projects. Gabriella planted a garden in the yard, vegetables and flowers mixed together in cheerful chaos. Little Ethan took his first steps in that house, wobbling across the kitchen floor into Ethan's waiting arms. They celebrated his first birthday in June with a small party, and this time more neighbors attended, the scandal slowly fading as people saw how happy the little family was. Ethan built furniture during the day and came home to his wife and son every evening. It was a simple life, but it was everything he had ever wanted without knowing he wanted it. Gabriella cooked meals that filled the house with delicious smells, and they ate together as a family, talking about their days and making plans for the future. At night, after little Ethan was asleep, they would sit on the porch and watch the stars come out over the New Mexico desert. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they sat in comfortable silence, but always they were together. "You ever regret it?" Gabriella asked one night, "stopping to help me that day?" "Never," Ethan said immediately. "That was the day my real life started. Everything before that was just me wandering, looking for something I could not name. But it was you. It was always you. I just did not know it yet." She leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. "I used to feel guilty about Roberto," she admitted, "about not loving him the way I should have. But Father Miguel helped me see that staying in a loveless marriage would have hurt him more in the long run." "Do you think he is happy now?" Ethan asked. "I hope so. He deserves to find someone who will love him the way he deserves to be loved." They got word a few months later that Roberto had married a widow in Santa Fe, a woman with 2 young children who needed a father. The news brought a sense of closure, a final proof that they had all made the right choice, even though it had been painful. Life continued its steady rhythm. Little Ethan grew into a bright, energetic toddler who kept them both busy. He looked like Gabriella with his dark hair and eyes, but he had Roberto's smile, and neither Ethan nor Gabriella ever tried to hide his true parentage. The boy knew that Roberto was his father, but that Ethan was his papa, the man who raised him and loved him as his own. When little Ethan was 3 years old, Gabriella told Ethan she was pregnant again. He picked her up and spun her around, then set her down carefully, suddenly worried. "Should I have done that? Are you okay?" she laughed, that beautiful sound that still made his heart skip. "I am fine. This pregnancy is going to be very different from the last one. I plan to have this baby in a bed in a hospital with a doctor present." "That sounds like an excellent plan," Ethan agreed. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and in January of 1889, Gabriella gave birth to twin girls. Dr. Harrison delivered them in his clinic, and Ethan was there to hold her hand through the whole process. It was nothing like that desperate day on the tree trunk, but it was no less miraculous to watch his daughters come into the world. They named the twins Alina and Emma, and little Ethan was fascinated by his new sisters. He wanted to hold them constantly, and would sit beside their cradle telling them stories in his 3-year-old vocabulary that nobody else could quite understand. The house that had seemed so spacious suddenly felt small with 3 young children, so Ethan built an addition, expanding their home to accommodate their growing family. Gabriella's garden expanded too, and she started selling her extra produce at the market, using the money to buy fabric for curtains and clothes for the children. Years passed in a blur of happy chaos. The twins grew into mischievous 4-year-olds who were constantly getting into trouble, while Ethan Jr., as they called him to avoid confusion, became a serious 7-year-old who loved helping his papa in the workshop. Roberto visited once when the twins were 5. He brought his wife and stepchildren, and the two families spent an awkward but ultimately pleasant afternoon together. Roberto held his son, now almost 8 years old and looking more like him every day, and they talked about school and friends and the model ship Ethan Sr. was helping him build. "He is a good boy," Roberto said to Gabriella privately. "You have done well raising him." "We have done well," Gabriella corrected gently. "He knows who you are, Roberto. We make sure he knows." "But Ethan is his father in all the ways that matter," Roberto said. "I made my peace with that a long time ago. I am just glad he has a good man in his life." Before Roberto left, he shook Ethan's hand. "Thank you for keeping your promise," he said, "for giving them a good life. Thank you for being the kind of man who could put their happiness above your own," Ethan replied. "That took more courage than I think I could have managed." By the time Ethan Jr. turned 10, in 1895, Las Lunas had grown from a small settlement into a proper town. The railroad had come through, bringing commerce and new residents. Ethan's carpentry business had expanded, and he now employed 2 other men, teaching them the craft while taking on bigger projects. Gabriella had started teaching at the local school, using the education her parents had insisted she receive. The twins were her students, along with 20 other children of varying ages, and she loved every minute of it. She would come home with stories about what the children had said or done, and Ethan loved watching her face light up as she talked. Ethan Jr. decided he wanted to be a doctor, inspired by Dr. Harrison, who still practiced in town, even though he was now in his 70s. He spent his free time at the clinic, learning everything he could, and Dr. Harrison took him under his wing with grandfatherly affection. The twins were interested in everything and nothing, changing their minds about what they wanted to be when they grew up on a daily basis. Alina announced one week that she would be a famous singer, the next week a horse trainer, and the week after that a botanist. Emma was more interested in mechanical things, taking apart any device she could get her hands on and usually managing to put it back together. On their 15th wedding anniversary, Ethan took Gabriella back to the place where they had first met. The arroyo was dry, as it usually was, the dramatic floods being infrequent events. They walked along the path where her wagon had broken down, where he had first seen her struggling with the wheel while clouds gathered overhead. "You remember?" he asked, taking her hand. "How could I forget?" she replied. "I was so scared. I thought I was going to die out here alone." They walked further, to the place where the cottonwood tree had fallen across the arroyo. The tree was still there, ancient and weathered but still standing. Ethan helped Gabriella climb up onto the trunk, and they sat where they had sat 16 years ago, where their son had been born into his hands during a raging flood. "This is where everything changed," Gabriella said softly. "This is where I met the love of my life." "You were already married to him," Ethan teased gently. "No," she said, turning to look at him. "I was married to a good man who deserved better than what I could give him, but I had not yet met the man I was meant to spend my life with." That happened right here on this tree in the middle of a disaster. Ethan kissed her soft and sweet, the same way he had kissed her on their wedding day and every day since. "I love you," he said. "I loved you from the moment I caught our son in my hands, even though I did not know it yet." "I loved you too," she admitted. "It terrified me, feeling that way about someone who was not my husband, but I could not help it. You saved our lives, but you also showed me what love could feel like." They sat on the tree for a long time, holding hands and remembering. Then they walked back to town together, to their home, to their children who were waiting for them. Life continued its steady forward march. Ethan Jr. went to medical school in Albuquerque, fulfilling his dream of becoming a doctor. The twins both graduated from school, Alina discovering a talent for teaching like her mother, and Emma finding work at the railroad, one of the first women they hired to work in their repair shop. Ethan and Gabriella watched their children grow into adults with pride and wonder. They had built something remarkable together, this family that had started in such unusual circumstances. Every birthday, every graduation, every milestone was a gift they never took for granted. Roberto came to Ethan Jr.'s medical school graduation, proud of the son he had created, even if he had not raised him. The young man introduced his two fathers to his professors and classmates without embarrassment or explanation, and if anyone thought the situation was odd, they kept it to themselves. "He is going to do great things," Roberto said to Ethan as they watched the young doctor receive his diploma. "You raised him well." "We all did," Ethan said. "It took all of us to make him who he is." When Ethan and Gabriella's 25th wedding anniversary rolled around in 1911, their children threw them a surprise party. The house was filled with friends and neighbors, many of whom had been skeptical all those years ago but had come to respect and admire the family the Daltons had built. Dr. Harrison, now in his 90s and still occasionally seeing patients, gave a toast. "I delivered 2 of the children in this family," he said, "but I heard the story of how the eldest was born, and I can tell you that what Ethan did that day was nothing short of miraculous. But the real miracle is what he and Gabriella built together afterward. They chose love, even when it was difficult, even when people judged them, and they created something beautiful." Ethan looked around the room at his family, at his son who was now a respected doctor, at his daughters who were making their own marks on the world, at his wife who still made his heart race after 25 years. He thought about that scared young man who had been drifting aimlessly through New Mexico territory, looking for something he could not name. He had found it. Not in gold or adventure or any of the things he thought he was seeking, but in a pregnant woman with a broken wagon wheel and a storm on the horizon. He had found it in the weight of a newborn baby in his hands, in the trust Gabriella had placed in him, in the family they had built together one day at a time. "Thank you," he said in his speech, looking directly at Gabriella. "Thank you for letting me catch you that day. Thank you for trusting me with your life and your son's life. Thank you for loving me even when it was complicated and difficult. Everything good in my life came from that one moment when I decided to stop and help a stranger. You were never a stranger, though. I think my heart knew you even before we met." There were tears and laughter, and the party went on late into the night. Their grandchildren, because yes, Ethan Jr. had married and had 2 children of his own, played in the yard while the adults reminisced about the old days. As the last guests were leaving, Gabriella and Ethan stood on their porch, arms around each other, watching the stars come out over the New Mexico desert just like they had done countless times before. "You know what I think about sometimes?" Gabriella asked. "What?" "I think about what would have happened if you had not come along that day, if you had taken a different route or left town an hour earlier or later. I would have died, probably, and our son with me." "But I did come along," Ethan said, "and you did not die. And here we are, 25 years later, with 3 grown children and 2 grandchildren, and a life that is better than anything I ever imagined." "Here we are," she agreed, leaning into him. They stood there for a long time, 2 people who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances, and built a life that had weathered every storm. The flood that could have killed them had instead brought them together, and they had never let go of what they found in those desperate hours on a tree trunk in the middle of rushing water. Inside the house, they could hear their children cleaning up from the party, their voices and laughter mixing together in a symphony of family. Ethan thought about all the moments that had led to this one, all the choices and chances and miracles, both small and large. He thought about Roberto, who he hoped had found his own happiness in Santa Fe, and about the courage it had taken for all of them to choose honestly over propriety. But mostly he thought about the woman in his arms, the one he had helped bring a baby into the world during a flash flood, the one who had trusted him with everything she had, the one who had chosen him even when it meant losing almost everything else. She was his home, his purpose, his greatest adventure. "I love you, Gabriella," he said, not for the first time and certainly not for the last. "I love you too, Ethan," she replied. "Thank you for catching us when we were falling." "Always," he promised. "For the rest of my life, I will always catch you." And he did. Through the years that followed, through the challenges and joys that came with growing older, through the births of more grandchildren and eventually great-grandchildren, Ethan kept his promise. He caught her when she stumbled, supported her when she was tired, loved her with a devotion that never wavered. When they celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary in 1936, they were both in their 70s, surrounded by a family that had grown beyond anything they could have imagined. Ethan Jr. was a renowned doctor with a practice in Albuquerque. Elena had become a school principal, carrying on her mother's legacy of education. Emma had opened her own repair shop and was teaching young women the skills they needed to work with engines and machinery. There were 12 grandchildren and 4 great-grandchildren at that anniversary party, and every single one of them knew the story of how their grandfather had delivered their uncle during a flash flood, while their grandmother gave birth on a tree trunk. It had become family legend, told and retold, embellished slightly with each generation but always containing the same core truth: that love could find you in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the most extraordinary lives grew from the most extraordinary circumstances. Roberto had passed away 2 years earlier, and his widow had sent a letter expressing her condolences and sharing that he had spoken often of the son he had given up, but never forgotten. Ethan Jr. had cried when he read it, mourning the father he had known but never lived with, grateful for the sacrifice that had given him the family he had. No regrets. Ethan asked Gabriella as they sat on their porch that evening after the party, watching another New Mexico sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "Not a single one," she said firmly. "Everything that happened, even the hard parts, led us here, and here is exactly where I want to be." Ethan pulled her closer, feeling the weight of their shared history in that simple touch. 50 years of marriage, but really 51 years since that day in the flood. 51 years since he had caught her son in his hands and promised to keep them both safe. He had kept that promise, and in keeping it, he had found his own salvation. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars began to appear, Ethan Dalton thought about the young drifter he had been, aimless and searching. He thought about the moment he had seen those storm clouds gathering and known that something terrible was about to happen. He thought about the choice he had made to stop, to help, to stay. It was the best choice he had ever made. Gabriella shifted in his arms, tilting her face up for a kiss, and he obliged her gladly. After 50 years, kissing her still felt like coming home. The desert night settled around them, warm and comfortable, and somewhere inside the house they could hear their family, their legacy, the proof that love could triumph even over the most impossible odds. They had started with a flood and a birth, with desperation and terror and a courage neither of them knew they possessed. They had built a life from those raw materials, adding love and patience and commitment day by day, year by year. And now, in the twilight of their lives, they could look back and see that every moment had been worth it. Every struggle, every scandal, every difficult choice had led them to this porch, this moment, this life they had created together. The cowboy who had kept a pregnant woman above water until her baby came had found more than he ever expected to find. He had found his purpose, his family, his forever. And as the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, Ethan Dalton held his wife close and gave thanks for storms and floods and broken wagon wheels, for all the unexpected disasters that had brought him the greatest blessing of his life. They sat there until the night grew cool and their children came to shepherd them inside, still together, still in love, still grateful for that day when a flash flood had changed everything. Their story would be told for generations, a testament to the power of love to find you when you least expected it, and to endure against all odds. The flood had passed, but what it had brought together would last forever.